What's the relationship between justice and care? To contextualize this question, we want to remember that the ethics of care claims that traditional moral theories emphasize justice above all, and the conception of justice is justice as impartiality. Those theories also tend to regard care as an optional extra, a kind of luxury for strictly personal contexts. But sometimes we have to choose between justice and care. So then we have to ask, what happens when justice and care conflict? Traditional moral theories and the ethics of care give different answers to what we ought to do. The ethics of care, of course, says that care is more important than justice in those cases. But liberal individualism teaches that justice will always win a conflict of that kind. Held says liberal individualism teaches that each person acts according to her own self-interest. Even when she appears to do otherwise, it's most often because she's making an implicit contract to promote her self-interest in the future in exchange for doing an apparently self-interested action now. I will give some examples of that a little bit later in this video. The ethics of care says we often act not out of our own self-interest, narrowly conceived, but in order to sustain or recognize or create important relationships. So traditional moral theories, mainstream dominant moral theories, Held uses all of those terms for the same tradition she's talking about. Those mainstream moral theories and the ethics of care represent two very different ways of analyzing people's motives for actions. So here's an example. Do the parents of a child care for the child with an implicit contractual understanding that the children will care for the parents when they become old and ill? And are we going to say that good children fulfill that contract out of a sense of justice? And I think we're going to say two things about that case. The first is that it would be rather horrible for parents to care for a child only out of self-interest, only because they think that the child will care for them later in life. And the second is, good children tend to care for their parents just because, as a recognition of the relationship, not because children feel bound by some kind of contract. So the ethics of care, again, says that parents care for children because it's an important relationship that most parents care about. That is, they value it highly. And most children care for their parents in old age for similar reasons, to recognize the relationship, to maintain it, not in order to fulfill a contract. Indeed, neither the parents nor the children would play their roles in a very virtuous way if they simply went through the motions of being a parent or went through the motions of being a child without actually caring. An extension of this point is that we don't play with children out of respect for the moral law. That would be fairly ridiculous. We play with children out of care and concern for their development. And you can also see this point in an extended way by watching the fact that parents care whether other family members take the time to care with the child, to play with the child, because that's a manifestation not only of that family member caring about the child, but also about that family member caring for the parent of the child. It becomes a part of the relationship with both to play with that child. Second example, friendship. Is friendship motivated by self-interest? Do we do things out of that motive? Do we meet our friends? Do we talk with them? Do we share details of our lives with them? Do we exchange gifts with them simply out of self-interest? Well, I think most of us, if we have a friend, or if we have someone who's pretending to be our friend, who has the motive of exchange rather than the motive of friendship, we're going to sense that, and we're not going to trust the person. We'll sense the fact that for them it's a quid pro quo. I do this for you, you do that for me. That's not a friendship in the ethics of care. A third area where we can ask this question, and where Held raises this question, is with regard to healthcare. There is a very unequal relationship between the individual patient and the medical system, even between the patient and any individual doctor. But corporate medicine certainly seeks its own self-interest, its profits, although there are still some nonprofit hospitals, for instance. But the patient is medically vulnerable and dependent upon the system to survive and thrive. But the ethics of care says society should care enough for the medically vulnerable to make sure that they get real care, because we care about one another. Not, for instance, because we're afraid that if infectious diseases are not treated, we ourselves will be at greater risk of infection. And doctors often end up at odds with the corporate medicine executives they work for, because the doctors are more about the patients. They care about them in the process of caring for them, and they want to provide care that is motivated by the needs of the patient, not by the desire for profit. So this is a case even where the doctor has a contractual relationship with the healthcare corporation. It's a case where care often trumps justice when the two of them conflict. So we have a general picture of the ethics of care in which we are not independent individuals ever. We're always embedded and encumbered with, embedded in and encumbered with, to get the right prepositions, we're always embedded and encumbered with relationships that condition our behavior. And if it's an uncaring relationship, Held wants us to revise it or replace it. And that's the location of our freedom in creating, revising, and replacing relationships. Finally, for this video, Held raises the question, do we love someone out of respect for their moral personhood? So looking back to Kant's formula of autonomy or formula of person/humanity. And Held's answer is absolutely not. We love someone as a particular person to be valued in their uniqueness. And so I want to give you a picture of what I call Held's formula of persons. She doesn't talk about it in exactly this way, but I think of this as Held's formula of persons in contrast with Kant's formula of persons of the categorical imperative. So if we look at this contrast, so if we look at this contrast between Kant's formula of persons and what I'm calling Held's formula of persons, we remember that Kant's formula of persons calls for us to respect other rational beings on the basis of their rationality and to respect ourselves on the same grounds of our own rationality, and to do so impartially. But the ethics of care emphasizes that personal relationships, in fact, require partiality. That is, a recognition of the particularity of special relationships. We saw something like this in Mill, in fact, when Mill argues that impartiality is not expected or required ethically in cases of family members, for instance. And Held is essentially trying to give the philosophical theory, the ethical theory behind a care for partiality. The other thing to be said there is Mill just says it's permissible, this partiality towards those we have special relationships with, whereas Held wants to say it's ethically required. If you think about it, a parent doesn't care for a child because of the formula of personhood. It's because the parent has a sense of responsibility for the care of the vulnerable baby who is the center of her or his universe. And so with regard to this, Held says personal relations, this is a quotation from page 95, personal relationships call for attitudes of partiality rather than impartiality. So caring justice is partial. It's justifiably preferential toward relationships that we exist within. And of course, that's a very different picture of justice from the one that Kant and Mill have given us.